The revolution was really to return back to the Reagan doctrines, and it's the idea that you don't go to war. You have a very strong military, you have an extremely strong economy, you bankrupt your enemies and adversaries so they don't attack you, but then you don't go and use superiority to attack them. So I don't know what you want to call it, principle realism, Reaganism. It was, I think, a common sense foreign policy. So Trump understood, but we understood at the very beginning of the Trump administration, something very fundamentally different happened in global economics, and that was the United States had the ability to frack.
Welcome to another episode of Counterculture, the show that stands at the intersection of reason and faith in the battle against sentimentality. America has had her share of foreign policy disasters that predate Mr. 10%, the big guy, President Biden. Though he was a cheerleader for many of those over the past 50 years, he didn't direct. But it feels like America's national security is more precarious than it's been since the War of 1812. Rather than avoiding conflicts with other world powers, one gets the sense we're careening toward them. Monroe, Nixon, Reagan. Is there any doctrine of a past president the current iteration of the D.C. foreign policy blob respects? I find it painfully difficult to identify a coherent conception of the world and America's role in it other than reward your enemies and alternate between punishing and ignoring your friends, which is all decidedly injudicious. Perhaps our guest can provide clarity. For the last 5 decades, K.T. McFarland has been both a student of geopolitics, working under the likes of Henry Kissinger at the National Security Council and Cap Weinberger at the Pentagon, and a frontline practitioner as a Pentagon spokesperson, and most recently as President Trump's Deputy National Security Advisor, where she was among those subjected to the Russian collusion witch hunt and other fever dreams of the left. KT is a prolific columnist, commentator, and author. Her latest book is entitled Revolution: Trump, Washington, and We the People. KT, thank you so much for joining on this episode of Counterculture. We appreciate it.
Well, I agree with everything you said. What's a coherent doctrine? There isn't one, except be bad to your friends and be really good to your enemies.
Yeah, well, that seems to be a problem. But before we even get to the incumbent administration, let's go back to the one that you most recently served in. That would be President Trump. And your book, Revolution. Was Trump's revolution, did that include principled realism? Was principled realism sort of his foreign policy philosophy, or the administration's governing foreign policy philosophy? Was that part of the revolution?
You know, the revolution was really to return back to the Reagan doctrines, and it's the idea that you don't go to war. You have a very strong military, you have an extremely strong economy, you bankrupt your enemies and adversaries so they don't attack you, but then you don't go and use superiority to attack them. So I don't know what you want to call it, principle realism, Reaganism. It was, I think, a common sense foreign policy. So Trump understood, we understood at the very beginning of the Trump administration, something very fundamentally different had happened in global economics, and that was the United States had the ability to frack and to produce oil and natural gas cheaply, safely, abundantly, so that not only could we be energy independent, which is great for us and great for our economy, but we could be energy dominant. We could really supply energy to the entire world. And then the knock-on effects of all of those things means you bankrupt your enemies, because Iran and Russia need high energy prices to start wars. China has to import energy. Why not import it from the United States? And it was also very good for the environment, because you can't flip a switch and get rid of all fossil fuels and somehow go to renewables. There has to be a bridge, and the bridge was clean, abundant, cheap, secure American natural gas.
So, one of the things that I think people are always curious about, given everything that transpired during Trump's tenure as well as subsequently, and since you were part of the national security team, is just exactly what was the Trump team's understanding of what they were dealing with in confronting the foreign policy establishment, particularly coming out of the Obama years, when you had sort of the first 2 terms, and now we have the third, of be good to your enemies and be dismissive, if not confrontational, with your friends. What did you guys understand was the internal threat facing this sort of return to common sense and peace through strength?
Well, I think we underestimated how nasty the response was going to be on the part of the people who had dug in to failed policies of 40 years. Not only we figured it would come from the left and the Democrats, And we figured it might come from some Republicans. We kind of underestimated how much the forever war lobby in the Republican Party, for example, would be anti-Trump. So I think we failed to us, it was so common sense. Why not do what you're good at doing? Why not bankrupt your enemies? Why not reward your friends? Why not have a strong economy? Why not have a strong national security, a strong national defense? But it wasn't common sense to an awful lot of people. And I think that was the shocker. We really, to us, it was just stunning that they would chase this sort of Russia hoax around in an attempt to discredit President Trump, to hogtie his administration from the very beginning, and yet not let us do what we were good at as a country.
The Forever War Party, that's a reference that's gained a lot more popularity since Trump. Now, but I mean, you go back, as I mentioned at the outset, to Kissinger. I mean, can you pinpoint, I mean, does it go back to Ike's warning of the military-industrial complex? When did the Forever Party really take hold in Washington, from your perspective?
Well, it happened, I think that Dwight Eisenhower, when he left office, he famously warned about the defense industrial complex. In other words, don't let American foreign policy be dictated by people who are going to make money off of it. The defense industrial complex. Don't look for a forever war. And yet the Vietnam War, when I was in the Nixon administration working for Henry Kissinger in the West Wing of the White House, that forever war was one that we couldn't win, but we couldn't figure out how to get out of. And as Henry, has said to me and to others time and time again, the United States gets into these wars with great enthusiasm, and then when it becomes difficult, it becomes protracted, the United States wants out, but it becomes very difficult for the leaders of the United States to get us out in a way that still preserves our national security interests. So the first forever war was Vietnam, but we did get out of Vietnam. The next forever war was Iraq, and that was great. After getting out of Iraq, the whole Middle East exploded. And then the final forever war, at least until a year and a half ago, the final forever war was Afghanistan, where we'd be in these wars. We had an initial objective going in. We kept changing what that objective was. We never matched our resources to our objectives. And then we got to a point where we knew we couldn't win, but we didn't want to lose. And so every president kind of kicked the can down the road to continue to fight, Afghanistan being the perfect example of a war we couldn't win, but we didn't want to lose. And so no president really faced up to how to defeat it. The great thing about there was another forever war, which was a Cold War. And Reagan understood a very different thing. He said, well, we could win the Cold War. In the 1970s, 60s, 70s, the common wisdom, prevailing wisdom, was you could never defeat the Soviet Union. Best you could hope for was a forever war, a forever Cold War, where we didn't shoot each other, but we had the threat of nuclear annihilation hanging over both of us, and so we could kind of manage the situation. Reagan came into office and said, no, there's a Cold War, I'm going to win it. And we're going to, but we're not going to fight it with military battle on the military battlefield, as self-defeating for everybody. And we would fight it on the economic battlefield, on the technology battlefield, on the diplomacy battlefield, on the alliance battlefield, on the trade battlefield. And that's ultimately how we won the Cold War. We didn't fight the Soviet Union to a finish. We bankrupted them. So they had no choice but to stop the Cold War and the Cold War on our terms.
Right. And I mean, George Will famously said, right, the Cold War is over, the University of Chicago won it. That the internal contradictions of the Soviet Union would ultimately be their undoing. And when Gorbachev moved to open up the Soviet Union a little bit with glasnost and perestroika in order to save it, he unwittingly expedited its demise. I wonder if that is still something that we can do with our preeminent enemies today, exploit the internal contradictions in China and that totalitarian regime under President Xi, or have we gotten to a point different than the Reagan era where our own internal contradictions are almost as problematic as the internal contradictions of our enemies?
Well, so I was part of all of these administrations, and I can tell you, we could do the same thing again today. It would be a little different, but we could do the same thing with, let's say, China, with Russia, with Iran, as we did during the Reagan administration. And that's because, as I said, the Reagan administration came in, bankrupted the Soviet Union. One of the ways they bankrupted the Soviet Union was to drive down the price of oil. Now, we didn't have the oil or natural gas ourselves to force the price to drop, but we convinced the Saudis and others to drill baby drill, or to turn on the pumps. And the price of oil went from $40 to $18 a barrel in 9 months. Russian income was cut in half. They were broke. We could do the same thing today, but we would have more control over it in a funny way because of the United States in the last 10 years realizes that we have oil and gas we can get out of rocks. That's called fracking. And shale oil, shale gas. And then we can do it, not like it was expensive like it was 10 or 15 years ago, but our technology, our entrepreneurs, our engineers figured out a way to get the oil and gas out of rocks very cheaply, safely, efficiently. So all of a sudden we have this huge advantage that nobody else in the world can do. By the way, our rocks are the best rocks in the world for these purposes. So we can control the world price of oil. We can control the world price of gas. We have enough energy in the United States to power the world for several hundred years if we would only use it. And when we use it, we drive the price down. Great for our economy, really bankrupts the bad guys. And as it was during the Reagan administration, once you bankrupt the bad guys, they can't get into trouble. You know, if you look at the history of the Soviet Union and then Russia, when oil prices were high, the Russian Soviet leaders, they increased their defense budget, they invaded their neighbors, they had proxy wars around the world. When oil prices were low, they had to hunker down at home to hope to feed their own people. We were just at the point of doing this towards the final year or two of the Trump administration with Iran, where we knew that Iran needed high oil prices. They were not high because of American fracking. Iran had cut off supplies and money to Hezbollah, to Hamas, to the Houthis. Iran didn't have any extra money to pay for its foreign adventures. Iran had to keep the money at home to try to feed its own people to forestall a sort of a domestic uprising. And so if we had continued down that path, we would have had Iran on its knees. Sadly, when the Biden administration came in, they did a couple of things. They embraced Iran as their best friend, tried to appease Iran, thinking, well, that's how we'll get peace in the Middle East. And then they had their war on American fossil fuels, which predictably drove the price up, made Russia rich, made Iran rich. What did they do? They attacked their neighbors. They built up their military. It's as simple as that. It's just that somehow the Democrats, and especially the far left, they don't seem to get it.
I want to go back to Kissinger and China, and of course, the credit he gets for the open door policy during the Nixon administration. And what's your sense of his evolution of thinking over the last 50 years on China? Because it seems to me, correct me if I'm wrong, just a perspective, that he was part of a group of, think tankers and foreign policy experts who believe that the way to avoid conflict with the emerging Chinese communist Chinese communist China, that country, was to open up our markets, to do business, and you don't go to war with your trading partners. But what it turns out, arguably, I think now looking back, is that what we did is underwrite the rise of the Communist Party and the rise of China as a superpower in the process. So was that understood? Was that a concern? Is that how you read what happened over the last 5 decades, or is it something else that transpired?
Yeah, I think it's important to sort of judge decisions that were made at the time they were made and in the context they were made. When Kissinger was in office, and again, I was the most junior aide of the National Security Council, working in his immediate office in the West Wing, the thinking was that China, which had been isolated from the world, was going to, at some point, enter the world. And under whose auspices would they enter it? We didn't want them to enter the world under the Soviet Union's auspices. We wanted it to be ours. So Kissinger and President Nixon's goal was to drive a wedge between China and the Soviet Union. It was called the Sino-Soviet Alliance. Well, we shattered that. And as a result, China was, our younger brother, or they came into the world under our auspices, and the Soviet Union was alone. Now, that made a lot of sense for 10, 20 years. But then by 2000, when China had pretty definitely decided it was going to go for rapid economic advancement, and they wanted to enter all the international trading organizations, they wanted to enter as a developing country, not because they wanted to be trading partners with us, but they wanted to replace us. So when Kissinger and the foreign policy community in 1970, 1980, 1990, their idea was, we'll do with China what we did with Japan, with Korea, with Germany. We will help them build up. They will open their economies, open their societies. They'll be trading partners with us. And as you said, you don't go to war with your trading partner. China had a very different plan. A long time for us to catch on to it. I was very critical of Republicans, my own party. I mean, it kind of broke with my own party in the early years of the 21st century, because I said, look, they forever were in the Middle East. We're kind of ignoring, we've got our eyes off the ball. The real threat here is going to be coming from China. And sure enough, that's what happened. China used those last 20 years to build up. And to the point where now it's not only our peer competitor in a lot of economic areas, but it wants to be our peer competitor, if not superior, in a lot of military areas. There's certain weapon systems that the Chinese have that we don't. For example, hypersonic weapons. We can't get them off the drawing board. China's already starting to produce them. So I think that the evolution of China, when I asked Kissinger about this 10 or so years ago, do you think it was a mistake to open to China, to help China along? And he said, well, nobody thought China would go as fast as they did. And so I concluded from that the mistake was not that we opened to China, but it was the idea that we took our eye off the ball of China and what its intentions were. And so that's why we are where we are today.
Well, and then we saw when Xi visited America recently for that Pacific Rim conference, with the streets in San Francisco lined with the communist flags. It was lovely. And we had all these American CEOs, genuflecting before Xi. It was sort of a shameful display as far as I'm concerned. But what does that say about sort of our cultural recognition still may be behind the learning curve with respect to what you were talking about, which was obvious at the beginning of this century? And what should we do to, impress upon corporate leaders in America just exactly what needs to be done?
Here's the dilemma. So Xi Jinping came to the United States. He didn't really care about meeting Biden or all those other people. He came to the United States because he wanted to meet American bankers and American Silicon Valley giants, because his economy is in trouble for a whole lot of reasons. I won't go in the weeds about why, but it's in trouble and it's not likely to reverse. So what Xi Jinping needs is American investment in China. He needs American corporations to help him out. He needs American bankers to help him out, and he needs American technology companies, Silicon Valley, to invest in and do trade with China. So that's why he was there. He wanted that, as you say, the genuflecting dinner with all of those leaders, figuring that those people who run the American economy would pressure whatever U.S. government was in power, and then to have closer economic relations with China. Here's the problem. I mean, in a democracy, in a free market capitalism, you want your companies to make money. You want them to make a lot of money, as much money as they can. But you have to prevent them from doing stuff that might be okay for their companies and their stockholders in an immediate sense, but very wrong for the United States national security in the long run. So I don't think it's a matter of going to those people, American presidents, saying, now guys, don't do trade with China. I think it's a matter of saying, look, we're going to have one set of playing rules in the United States. Here's what they are. We're not going to be able to have the kind of thing that you've been doing with China, where you've been enriching China at the expense of U.S. national security. We're going to take the bigger picture on this, and we're going to say, no, you can't do it. Or we're going to have export controls. That's what we did in the Reagan administration and in the Trump administration. We controlled what kind of things could go to China, what kind of things could go to the Soviet Union. We didn't let them have all of our stuff. We had restrictions on it. And as a result, we were able to use what our competitive advantages, our technology, our entrepreneurial spirit, our banking system, our political system, and, frankly, our military. But you have to make it possible for American corporations to help you in this, not to push them away, or certainly not to take orders from them.
Is there a message that we can send domestically? You've seen measures advanced. Ron DeSantis banning Chinese Communist Party ownership of land in Florida, trying to uproot the Confucius Institutes that have been set up within universities. Even more serious, perhaps, sort of a Chinese communist police station in New York, monitoring Chinese nationals in New York. Some pretty Orwellian stuff. Are those the kind of things that if we addressed with moral clarity, it would sort of maybe send a message to America writ large about that threat and get everybody a little bit more aligned, while still, as you say, being respectful of our free enterprise orientation?
Yeah, I think that the country, one of the great achievements of President Trump, I don't think he set out to do it, but this is the result, is that he woke the country up to the China threat. When President Trump was running in 2016 and again in 2020, he said, China, 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 China's the real problem. And everybody made fun of him at the time. My colleagues at the Council on Foreign Relations and all the think tank guys, he doesn't know what he's talking about, he's hysterical. And even in the 2020 election, Joe Biden said, oh, China's not going to eat our lunch. They're our friend. Hey, man. And President Trump was saying, China. Well, as a result, I think that the national mood and attention has shifted so that people understand, China is a threat. Now, what are we going to do about it? And how do we take plans? I mean, it's all the things you talked about. But let's say there's something like TikTok. TikTok is owned by the Chinese Communist Party. And TikTok plays with its algorithm to scramble the brains of young Americans under the age of 25. TikTok is their primary news source. So maybe what we should do is ban TikTok. Certainly TikTok is banned in China. They don't let their people have unfettered access to TikTok. They certainly don't have freedom of navigation of the internet in their countries. So maybe what we should do is look at something like that. We should also look at, like you said, Ron DeSantis has said you can't buy farmland, you can't buy land in Florida. Well, how about that China's not allowed to buy any land near American military installations or American testing grounds? Or maybe we should say to the Chinese, hey, you know what? We're not going to invest in your companies that build military weapons, military equipment, American pension funds. We shouldn't be able to have investments in Chinese companies. We should not be funding our own demise. Those are all things I think a national government, a strong president would do with congressional, cooperation. And I think that we're just coming around to understanding how serious the China threat is. And I would give a shout out to a congressman in the great state of Illinois and from the great state of my home state of Wisconsin, who have both Republican and Democrat have a joint committee where they are looking into the China threat, and they're doing great stuff. And they're way out ahead of the Biden administration, way out ahead of the State Department, and saying these are the problems. This is what we should be doing about it. I think that that's the direction we go in. My hunch is that the American people will get us there, but it's going to be more painful.
I think they made fun of Trump so much when he talked about China because the way he pronounced China. I think that was part, yeah. But so the other thing too, and maybe this is also a good indicator of a recognition, these Chinese communist-backed electric battery plants in Michigan, in exurban Illinois, Manteno, and the locals sort of revolting against the location of a business that's that is associated with the Chinese Communist Party, number one. But number two, because of the hundreds of millions, in some cases billions of dollars in state and federal subsidies to a company that's clearly controlled by, like Ocean, a company that's clearly controlled by Chinese Communist Party, and taxpayers are getting wind of this, and they're putting pressure on their elected officials. In fact, in Michigan, they recalled all their elected officials who were part of that deal to locate that Chinese communist-backed EV plant in their community.
Mm-hmm. Well, the other thing is this. So President Biden's big, I don't know what he calls it, I keep forgetting the name, about his economic recovery or Inflation Reduction Act. What it really ought to be called is the Chinese Prosperity. Because all of the tens and hundreds of billions of dollars we're supposed to be spending on the Green New Deal and on climate change, we're spending it in China. China's cornered the market on all of the component parts of renewables. We shouldn't be doing that. Why are we making China rich? As you point out, why are we making China powerful? Why are we paying for China to supplant the United States as the most dominant world power? It doesn't make any sense.
I want to talk a little bit about Russia. You mentioned, I mentioned it, you mentioned as well, the Russian collusion matter at the outset of the 2016 campaign, and then certainly ramped up when Trump took office. Can you give our viewers a sense of what that was like on a day-to-day basis as it persisted for a couple of years, and the Mueller investigation and all the political machinations with respect to subpoenaing all these officials in the Trump administration, and how debilitating that was in terms of the work that the national security team was doing, and what else you saw from the inside?
Yeah, and so, I mean, I've worked at 4 Republican administrations and I've spent an awful lot of time in and out of the West Wing of the White House and the Oval Office. There's only so much oxygen in the Oval Office. And so if the President of the United States is having to focus a good bit of time, or his staff is having to focus a good bit of time on defending themselves against false accusations, they're not spending that same time they might be doing helping the economy, helping the American environment, helping the American education system. They're spending way too much time dealing with something that we all knew at the time was made up, but the media kept hammering it home. I mean, the media was part of, in fact, leading the Russia collusion efforts and that whole hoax. What it's like as a person, though, is, I mean, I'm a deputy national security advisor. My job, my office was, 40 footsteps away from the Oval Office. And I and various other people, including the president, including other people in the administration, were targeted. Not because we had done anything wrong, and they knew we hadn't done anything wrong, but they wanted to get Donald Trump. I mean, I myself was subpoenaed and I had to testify. I had to hire very expensive lawyers, six-figure lawyers, seven-figure lawyers, to make sure that I was defended against crimes I did not commit, but that they were kind of trying to force me into really, let me just tell you, there was a horrible night where it was pretty clear that the Mueller investigation wanted me to either confess to lies, perjury, in other words, confess to a crime I didn't commit, or accuse President Trump of committing crimes that I knew he didn't commit. And there was a certain point where I turned to my husband and said, God, maybe I should just give them what they want. They're going to hound me to my grave. We're having to mortgage the house to get out of this. And my husband wisely said, no, you'll never live with yourself. You just have to stick it out and always tell the truth. So I did, at which point the Mueller investigation went away. But they knew that if they could go after people in the Trump administration, they could bankrupt them. They knew he hadn't committed any crimes, but they wanted to get everybody in the Trump administration, and the way they could get them was to bankrupt them, because you have to pay for your own defense. There's no government slush fund that says, okay, I'll pick up that six-figure bill that you're getting from your lawyers. Even if you're found innocent, you're never charged with a crime. You still have to pay for your own legal defense. So that's the sort of dirty secret that nobody outside of Washington understands, that the way they get you is not for a crime you committed, either before, during, or after, that they figure you'll just cry uncle and give up and give them what they want, because otherwise you face economic ruin.
That's why they call it lawfare. It's an apt term. It's war by other means. And so after the Mueller investigation subsided, as Deputy National Security Advisor, and just throughout your career, I mean, you're dealing with elected officials on both sides of the aisle. I mean, what was that like after the Democrats, the Adam Schiffs of the world, put the entire administration, the entire country through this, and the lying, the character assassination, the financial punishment? I mean, then how do you return to work and try to deal with these people on the level?
Yeah, their whole point is you don't get to return to work. You're so tarnished, you're so sullied by any investigation that you don't get to return to work. I mean, when it was all over for me, and the Mueller investigation kind of went away, they knew they weren't going to break me. So they gave up on me and went on to somebody else. But I left the country. My husband said, let's get out of here. You gotta just get your feet back under yourself. And so I don't know if I told you this, Dan, but we got into a car, we drove to Newark Airport, got on an airplane, flew overnight to Glasgow, Scotland, which is on the west coast of Scotland. We rented a car, we drove all the way to the ocean, to the west coast. We got on a ferry boat and went to the most remote Hebridean islands, where there were no people, or just a few people. This is in the middle of the winter. There were sheep, there was scotch, there was a lot of rain, but no Wi-Fi, no cell phone, no TV, no nothing. And I had to start thinking about, gee, okay, so what do I do next in my life? My career, the job I'd always wanted, that's no longer going to be an option for me. But then I thought, who are these people trying to destroy America from within? Has it ever been this bad in our country? People are saying now, oh, it's never been this bad. And then I realized, actually it has been this bad. And maybe not in my lifetime, but it was this bad during the Civil War. It was this bad during the Industrial Revolution. There were always these political fights between the guys in power, the elites in power, and the people who said, you're not getting the job done. We want to get rid of you. We want new people, new ideas to come in. And we do it seems to have these revolutions, which is the title of my book, every 40 years, when the government gets so, sort of separated from the people of the country, because our founding fathers understood that power is the ultimate, if you have power, you want to keep it, you'll do anything to keep it. And so you have to have a revolution to get rid of the entrenched bureaucracy, the entrenched elites. And that's what we do with the ballot box. And that's why I think it's so important that we have credible elections, that we have trust in those elections, and that they can go on so the American people can say what they feel is the right policy for going forward, and not some clique in Washington who says, we've got the power now, we're going to keep it forever. Because not only is it wrong, in a democracy, but they're usually not very good at it. I mean, look at American foreign policy in the last 20 years. Forever wars, we've let China get ahead. If you look at the world's on fire right now because these same people are in charge. And yet, somehow the American people say, we've had enough. So we have to actually go to the ballot box and make sure that Washington understands they've had enough.
I got to say, that vacation, a remote hamlet in Scotland with a bottle of scotch, that sounds, no people, that sounds pretty attractive. You know, you're never alone with a bottle of scotch. But with respect to that experience, Trump gets reelected in 2024, or some other Republican, let's say somehow somebody surprises and DeSantis surprises and he wins the nomination and he gets elected. If they called you and said, KT, we want you to come in, we want you to be National Security Advisor, we want you to be Secretary of State, we want you to be a senior level official as part of our national security team, would you go back?
Well, let's just get a Republican elected first. But what I will say is that I'm very confident that whoever the Republican candidate is will win, and then that new president is going to have the same policies. They'll reverse the Biden stuff, which is loony on every single heading. And they'll go back to the kind of policies that Donald Trump had, which are really the same policies that Ronald Reagan had in the 1980s. And, you know, Ronald Reagan had one of the best runs of peace and prosperity in the history of the country. It lasted for almost 2 generations. So the opportunity is there for the United States with different leadership, with different policies to really rise and thrive again. We just need the right people and the right ideas, and not this sort of constantly appeasing, whether it's Russia, China, Iran. You know, your adversaries are not going to sort of settle down and be nice to you the more you give them. They're only going to settle down and be nice to you if they have to. And that's why you force economic, technological, and in other ways force them into positions that you control, not them.
What was your relationship like with Trump? Because, I mean, he'd been talking about China actually for a long time. You know, there's these clips going back to him talking about China in the 80s on the Oprah show. But I mean, he doesn't have the geopolitical knowledge that you have or other longtime professionals in the space have. And so what was that dynamic? Sort of, he has this general sense of the direction to go, and then the foreign policy team helps to fill in the blanks to get from point A to point B in furtherance of what the president wants to do, or, you know, what was the give and take like? I think people are always fascinated by how he actually manages, particularly something that even with his interest, he didn't have any experience in coming out of the private sector.
No, but his instincts are just unfailing. You know, the thing, and this is the reason why I supported Trump in the 2016 election and not the traditional Republican candidates. I thought, the traditional Republican candidates is going to be more of the same. You know, they're not going to stand up to China. We're going to have a continuation of the forever wars in the Middle East. But Trump offered a very different course, not just because he wasn't part of Washington and that he wasn't part of the sort of foreign policy world. He was a businessman, and that was to his great advantage because he knew which levers to pull, but the guys in Washington had no idea how to use. And so what President Trump did was, again, as you say, he'd been talking about China for a long time. He also had been talking about the forever wars for a long time. He had also talked about if the United States could be energy independent using our own energy, we don't have to be in the middle of these sort of psychodrama wars that have been plaguing the Middle East for 2,000 years. So he set the sort of general theme, and this is a very different direction than had been taken by Republican or Democrat presidents before President Trump. And then it was left to people like me and others to say, okay, so how do we fill in the blanks? I mean, you know, the rubber hits the road. What are the specific policies we take? Are we going to ban certain technologies from being exported to China? Are we going to ban certain investments in the United States from going into China? Are we going to bankrupt our adversaries by using American energy to do it? Are we going to build up our defenses? And in which case, which ones? The Army, the Navy, advanced weapons, satellite defense, all of those things were what he has a staff to do. But President Trump himself has just unbelievable instincts of really zeroing in on what's the main event and you get the fluff, all the fluff that the foreign policy world is just so focused on. Trump always goes right to the heart of it. And that's why I think he was just a transformational president.
When Trump talks about, if he's reelected, he'll end the war in Ukraine, per the Russian invasion. He could end it in a day. Now, that's probably just a bit hyperbolic, but, you get the point that he wants to negotiate a deal to end the war. And interestingly, talking about his instincts, you're starting to hear more people say that weren't saying it very long ago, like Richard Haas, the former president of the Council on Foreign Relations, who just said, it's time for us to cut bait, get Zelensky to the negotiating table and figure out a way to end this, because he doesn't see the desired retaking by Ukraine of all the land that was seized as realistic. Kissinger, just going back to him, he also had a bit of an evolution over time on Ukraine, first suggesting that Ukraine not be admitted to NATO, and then at the end saying that the war needs to end as soon as possible, and NATO should be admitted Ukraine should be admitted to NATO. Sort of, my intuition was he sort of saying, end the war, and end the hostilities, end the carnage, and then put Ukraine in NATO, and the NATO alliance, Ukraine being part of it, will be the deterrent that stops Russia, in the Donbass region, and they go no further, Donbass region and Crimea. So, what's your handle on a deal to end the hostilities in Ukraine and force Zelensky to the negotiating table and encourage Putin? I mean, is that realistic? Is what Haas proposed or what Kissinger was suggesting? Are those viable plays to make in Eastern Europe?
I mean, Donald Trump thought of those over a year ago when it was first happening. And I know Dr. Kissinger was a mentor of mine and remained a close friend throughout his life. Richard Haas is somebody I went to graduate school with and I've known for my entire adult life. So both of those guys, and particularly with regard to Ukraine, I think they were wrong. And they continue to be wrong for a long time, both for different reasons. But Donald Trump had it right. Just end this silly war. Not silly war, but end this war. You're not going to have, Ukraine is not going to invade Russia. Ukraine is not going to be able to stop Russian advances forever. Russia's not going to win either. This is a situation where neither country wins this war. And the United States, especially the United States, is supporting Ukraine. But there's no accountability. Where's our $100 billion? Where's it gone? We don't know. The weapons, yeah, at the expense of our readiness, probably. Has it gone to corruption in Ukraine? You bet it has. But there's no accountability. But Trump was right from the very beginning. Now, I think it would take him more than 24 hours, but he could do it in a week. And here's how you do it. Is number one, you go to the Russians and you say, we're going to have energy independence. We're turning back on the spigot of the United States oil and natural gas. You're going to be bankrupt. Then the next thing you do is you go to Zelensky and say, you want American weapons? We want to know where's the money going? And we want to know what your plan is for ending this war, because nobody's going to win it on the battlefield. And then the next part of the Trump the Trump doctrine would be, okay, get a deal. Neither side's going to like everything about it, but it'll be enough for everybody to live with. And then once the fighting stops, what happens then? And then the Western world, of Russia into Ukraine, we're going to put $1 trillion into investing in Ukraine. The United States, Europe, other countries. It's going to be a really amazing gold mine of economic opportunity in Ukraine. Meanwhile, what happens after the fighting stops in Russia? Nobody's going to go invest in Russia. Nobody's going to rebuild Russia. There's a pariah state. And it's also, it's a lawless state. So 5 years after the fighting stops, Russia's isolated. It's by itself. It's broke. Its only ally is China. Meanwhile, 5 years after the fighting stops, Ukraine, economically integrated into the Western economies, probably joins NATO. So that you can't win the war, but you can win the peace, but you got to be willing to play the long game, which the Biden administration is still encouraging these people in Ukraine to, no, we're going to give you more stuff. You're going to be able to, push Russia back to Moscow. It's just not going to happen. So let's be realistic about how we can win the peace.
What about being realistic in the Middle East, the other theater that is most salient right now? I want to get your assessment of what the capacity is for Islamofascist organizations to commit acts of terror in the West. We spent 20 years bombing the hell out of Al-Qaeda and ISIS and tracking them down, and we spilled a lot of blood and spent a lot of treasure doing that. And yet now, after the October 7th terrorist attack by Hamas, and the response, and the protesting in the West. What do we see? We're seeing now, these are one-offs, but that's the question. All of the sort of seeds that were planted in the West with respect to multiculturalism and de facto open borders, some of that bearing poisonous fruit, and these one-off Islamist-inspired terrorist attacks in Germany, or planned in Germany, affected in France and Paris, affected in the Philippines, question about the nature of the attack in Dublin, and obviously concern about individuals on the terrorist watch list because of our open border of the United States being poised to commit acts of terror on the homeland. And so I just wonder, are we in a situation where it's one-offs, or does the West face real threat from the sort of organized Islamist terrorist organizations that existed 2 decades ago yet again?
Well, if you have enough one-offs, it's no longer one-off, right? Then it's a pattern. I think that after September 11th, the Treasury Department and international organizations did a pretty good job of making sure large chunks of money weren't moving around for terrorists to use over border. So that's why you have increasingly what you've seen is not big planned attacks in the United States or in Europe, as much as it's been little cells that have pulled them off. So I think that's manageable, because with intelligence, particularly if the FBI stops investigating, housewives in Loudon, Virginia, and starts investigating terrorists and does its job, that we can protect the United States domestically. But the bigger picture is sort of what's going on in the Middle East. And I am terrified and I think it's a miracle that we have not lost an American life yet, with all of these some 50 attacks that Iranian proxies are fighting, and attacks against American interests now, just in the last couple of days, against American warships. So I think we need to really rethink this. The Biden administration, of course, its only answer is to make a couple of threats and then be really nice to Iran, hoping that that's going to work. It won't work. I think what we need to do is what we learned in the beginning of the Trump years, is that when the Syrians were using chemical weapons on their people, President Trump went in and blew up the airfields where the chemical weapons aircraft was leaving from. You didn't hear from the Syrians for a long time. The way to deal with it now is go blow up those missile batteries that are from they're not from Iran, they're from Iran's proxies. Blow them up. Make sure that anybody who knows if they're going to fire on the United States, they're going to be dead within a few minutes. And do it immediately at the time. Don't just threaten them, just do it. And then, again, have American energy turn back on and bankrupt Iran. And then finally, stand with Israel. I am so worried that the United States administration, Biden administration, is going to step away and step back from Israel before giving Israel the chance to finish the job. And then it just perpetuates.
Well, right, and this middling, the tough talk from Joe Biden, but then the Tony Blinken report, the reports that Blinken is trying to keep Bibi on a short leash, if you will. Not that he's going to be able to do that, but that's the posture of the administration. They're sort of saying one thing, but they're middling the issue for political reasons because of the nature of their domestic constituencies. I guess the question would be, though, how much is Israel really relying on the United States, and how much are they going to do what is required to be done, regardless of where the Biden administration falls over the rest of its tenure?
What Israel needs from the U.S., and nobody else can supply this to Israel, is weapons, backfilling the weapons. They're using a lot of weapons in the Gaza, dealing with Hamas in Gaza. And then the other thing they need is American intelligence. If they don't get those, or if the Biden administration slow walks it, it makes Israel's job much more difficult. And it also needs American diplomatic support. In the Trump administration, what we did was bankrupt Iran, and then Iran couldn't afford to pay for Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis and all those other groups. And they all complained to Iran, saying, hey, wait a minute, where's our money? Where's our money? And Iran said, we don't have enough to give you. We have to deal with our own populations, or we're going to be out of power. But when you sort of look forward at what's Israel's job going to be, if Israel is separated from the United States. If the United States does what Vice President Harris is sort of schizophrenic thing, where we're going to give you the weapons, but we don't really want you to use them. We want to make sure that you don't kill any civilians. Well, Israel isn't killing civilians. Hamas is killing its own people. But if the U.S., it looks like we're separated from Israel. and Iran is still rich, and we're not punishing Iran economically or in any other way, then I think others come after Israel. Hezbollah, other groups will say, oh, this is our time. We have a weak Israel, an Israel is distracted domestically, politically, and Israel that is not backfilled by the United States. This is our moment. And then you have a risk of a much bigger war, because Israel has a great difficulty fighting this kind of a war for an extended period of time without American weapons.
Yeah, another region that has been under discussed, maybe until recently with the election of Javier Milei, is the Americas. And Marco Rubio made this point actually right before the Argentinian election that Milei won, which is, the Biden administration in the Americas. We've missed opportunities to strengthen our ties with Central American countries and South American countries because we're so focused on punishing our erstwhile friends because we disagree with their domestic politics in Guatemala or in El Salvador. And I wonder, and meanwhile, propping up Maduro in Venezuela and so forth. I mean, the same sort of upside down foreign policy that we've talked about the rest of the world. What are the opportunities in the Americas, and particularly how much hope do you have for the impact that Milei can have in Argentina and maybe throughout South America?
All right. So in the Trump administration, the first sort of diplomatic achievement was an agreement, an economic agreement between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. Our plan was that could be built upon, that it would start out as a trade agreement, but because of energy in North America, or American oil and natural gas, Canadian, Mexican, the refinery, that we could build those three countries into kind of an OPEC of our own, and become the energy source, not just for our own countries, but for the world. We could supplant and replace the Middle East and Russia because our energy would be safer, cheaper, cleaner, and we could export it to the world. So that was one piece of the strategy. Now, the Biden administration, their sanctimonious virtue signaling, all they want to do is to tell other countries how to conduct their own domestic business. China, on the other hand, just wants to do business with other countries. Now, those are the two extremes. We tell them what we want them to do. We're going to run things for you. And China says, I don't care. Just give us what we want from you, whether it's the natural resources, whether it's the port. And the world is having to choose, particularly what's called the Global South, which is South America, Africa, parts of Asia, South Asia, is that they're two sort of competing big powers who want to play in their countries. One is China saying, we'll give you what you want. Doesn't care. We don't care whatever you do with your people, but just give us what we want. And then the United States, which is, we'll give you stuff, but you got to follow our rules. I mean, there was a couple of months ago, and it got no attention in the media. Something like 20 African leaders sent a letter to the State Department saying, we've loved your assistance. We loved the Millennium Challenge, all the things you did to build our economies, to give us public health, to help eradicate AIDS and other diseases. But the problem is, you're telling us how we should conduct our own societies. And we have very different societies and different histories. We love your stuff. We want to cooperate with you, but don't boss us around. Of course, it fell on deaf ears. What's happened in Asia is that the Chinese looked like they were doing a terrific job in South America and Africa itself for many things they were investing in. They were hoping to have a sort of geopolitical Eurasian trade route that would include Africa and the Middle East, and somehow China was going to control that. A lot of countries are now taking a second look because they've been burned by China, and not only in Asia, but in Africa, but also in the South America. This should be our moment to go in and say, we're different. We're not going to boss you around and tell you what kind of religion you should have or how you should conduct your internal affairs or what your society should look like. We have basic rules, but the rest is up to you. But what we do want is an enduring economic and security relationship with you. I think that a lot of countries in the world want to hear that message right now, especially because China looked really great 5 years ago, but China's burned them all for a lot of reasons and in a lot of ways. I think that they would be open to that kind of a conversation. And yet it's one that we don't seem to have. It's like you said at the very beginning. We don't like our friends, but man, do we love to embrace our enemies. And it's gotten us nowhere. It's gotten us a world on fire.
And the impact that Milei could have as a
Sure.
high profile and quite outspoken ally of the West, starting with America?
Yeah, and what it'll do is it's like a domino effect in reverse, because if Milei has now great economic success in Argentina, which is the sort of nugget of why people support him, if he has economic success in Argentina, other countries in the region are going to say, well, if Argentina can do it, why can't we? We have more natural resources, we have a better educated population. So then I think you'll see other countries in the region looking at democracy, free market capitalism in a very different way. That's what happened in the Reagan administration, that a lot of those countries said, well, we want peace and prosperity too. And the American example or the Argentine example, they seem to be the best one that work in our country. So yes, I think it's like bad stuff in foreign policy is contagious. Well, good stuff can be too. And that's what, if we could only embrace this man and say, how can we help you succeed? I think it would be not just good for Argentina and the United States, but it could change the attitude of an entire, subcontinent.
This last issue is one I've been beating the drum on, really largely thanks to the reporting, the investigative reporting. Well, the cooperation of Elon Musk and the investigative reporting by people like Michael Schellenberger and Matt Taibbi, former State Department cyber intel guy Mike Benz, too. First, the Twitter files. And now more recently, this whistleblower that's provided a trove of documents and information to those same investigative reporters about this Cyber Threat Justice League, which sounds like something like Operation Chaos out of Get Smart or something. But unfortunately, it's real. And it's and this is the point that Mike Benz makes. It's international facing organizations, in this case with the Cyber Threat Justice League or Cyber Threat Intelligence League. It's the UK, former UK Intel, and US. So on top of the Twitter files, and this was going on during the Trump years too. All of this was allegedly. So and I mean, this is about the government controlling information, the free flow of information, sort of a hallmark of a free society. So what was the understanding about what federal agencies were doing, the censorship industrial complex they were standing up to make sure that 2016 never happened again, explicitly something that some of them said, working through Department of Homeland Security, setting up cutouts to influence what social media companies wouldn't allow, and then this larger cyber threat intel operation that included Britain. What was the understanding of that, and what was done if there was knowledge of it to try to nip it in the bud?
So here's the problem with all this, whether it's coming out of the Justice Department or Homeland Security or the FBI, and it's the weaponization of government, using it against political opponents and the American people. Maybe that includes, again, housewives in Virginia. Maybe it includes people of a different political party. But that's where their focus is censoring free speech. That's why Elon Musk is such a threat, because he says, let everybody have an opportunity to talk about it, and let in the free marketplace of ideas, we'll find the right plan. But the federal government, the permanent bureaucracy, the guys we don't elect, the faceless bureaucrats who cannot fire, we don't even know who they are, those are the people who think they're running things. And the attitude that we realized probably a little too late in the Trump administration was these guys look at a president and they say, presidents come, presidents go. We're here forever. We're the guys who are really in charge. You can't fire them. They get automatic cost of living and pay raises, and they're the guys who are setting the rules and working quietly behind the curtain to change American society to a society that they like. 97% of Washington, D.C. is far left Democrats. 94% of the federal government is Democrats. And they have an echo chamber. They don't think anybody does think differently. They think that they're doing good and right in the American thing. But what they are doing is crushing free speech, and they're crushing public opinion, and they're trying to scramble our brain, not just scramble our elections, but scramble our brains. And that's the biggest threat to democracy. Abraham Lincoln always said the biggest threat to America and the biggest threat to any free society in the history of the world has never come from outside of the country. It's always come from rot from within. And I think Washington's a pretty rotten place.
Well, this fifth column action that we're describing, I mean, if a Republican president takes over, I mean, what would be the advice and counsel? I mean, now you know, and even as you say, with the challenges of getting rid of people, you at least at the secretary level, at the deputy level, I mean, don't you have to, really pursue a sort of purge, or at least bring everything that there's a record of that was done behind the scenes for nefarious, unconstitutional, illegal purposes, and put it all out into the public arena? There's got to be something done that attaches consequences and accountability. And as you say, presidents come and go, but even with sort of rolling congressional oversight, that really comes and goes too. So you can't count on elected officials. That's the ironic thing. You have to count on essentially the appointments that elected officials make, it seems to me.
Yeah, and I don't want to get too much in the weeds, but there are several things you could do. Number one, most administrations focus on who's going to be the Secretary of State, who's going to be the Secretary of Defense. That's good. That's important. But the really important ones that you should fill right away in a change of administration are the sort of the lowest levels of your appointment, the Deputy Assistant Secretary, this or that, because that's the person who's as close to the permanent bureaucracy as you'll ever get. So make sure that on day one, that a new president has all those people decided, and they walk in, and there's no holdover from the previous administration. You just go in on day one. The next thing is to figure out how to take what's a permanent bureaucracy and make them not permanent. We, in the Trump administration, we sort of focused on, well, there are way too many people, right? The bureaucracy is way too big. You probably cut it by 30%, and it would be terrific. But how do you get rid of them? And then maybe you have buyouts, maybe you change the classification of their employment. These are all very weedy things, but they have to do with whether you're a political appointee or a permanent employee. If somebody is in government permanent and they're doing political things, they should be bounced out before the end of the day. And it will take a kind of a boring, department by department, office by office. Purge is the wrong word, but I think house cleaning would be a very good place to start.
She is Katie McFarland, coming to us live from her war room at home. Do not mess with Katie McFarland, personally or intellectually. Former Deputy National Security Advisor, the author of the book Revolution, which we discussed at length, at least parts of the Trump administration and her time there. Katie, thanks so much for joining us on Counterculture. Always appreciate talking to you, getting your insights.
Honor and a pleasure. And good for you for doing these in-depth conversations. Nobody else is doing it, and I think there's a real role here for Dan.
Thank you so much, from your mouth to the viewers' ears and eyes. We'll see. Thanks again, Katie. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Take care. Please like this video and subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. And please leave a comment in the comment section. We'd love to hear your thoughts.